Thank you for purchasing one of Elk Rack Trader's arrow craft kits. This video tutorial will help you with each step of making the arrow. The arrow in this kit will look just like this one. This kit includes one arrow shaft, one obsidian arrowhead, 1.5 yards of artificial sinew, and 3 feathers will be used as the fletching. What this kit does not include that you will need is Elmer's wood glue or Elmer's general purpose glue, a sharp pair of scissors, a utility knife with a razor blade, 2 clips or medium-sized binder clips, and not shown is a small tube of super glue. The first step for you to do is to locate the end of the arrow shaft that has the longer of the 2 notches. This is the end that you will place the arrowhead. Gently push the arrowhead into the notch and make sure that it is straight and not pointed at an angle to the left or to the right. You may have to reposition the arrowhead a few times until it is straight. The tip of the arrowhead should be in alignment with the arrow shaft. Now you're going to glue the arrowhead to the shaft. For this you will want to use Elmer's wood glue, preferably, or Elmer's general purpose glue. Take the Elmer's glue and spread a generous amount of glue along the spaces and areas where the notch of the arrow shaft is holding the arrowhead in place. Wipe away any excess glue that may start running or dripping. Place the arrow in an area to dry for 2 to 3 hours and make sure that the arrowhead isn't resting up against anything, because this may cause it to be pushed to the side while drying. While the glue is drying, this is a good time to go ahead and make the feather fletching for the arrow. Take the 3 feathers that were provided for you in the kit and decide which side of the feather will be the arrow fletching. You will use the same side of the other 2 feathers for the fletching. Place the feather with the bottom facing up on a cutting board and use a utility knife with the razor blade to carefully cut the quill of the feather in half lengthwise right down the center. Begin cutting into the quill beginning where you see the indentation on the back of the quill, and then very slowly and carefully begin pulling the feather toward you with one hand while holding the utility knife firmly in place with the other hand. When you are getting toward the tip of the feather, you may need to reposition the utility knife to better cut the remainder of the quill as it becomes narrower. After you have finished cutting the quill in half, start pulling the quill apart beginning from the top of the feather and work your way to the bottom. Pick which side of the split feather that you will use for the arrow fletching, and you will use the same side of the other 2 feathers. This helps the arrow fly straight if each of the feather fletching all bend the same direction. Repeat the process that you just used to split the other 2 feathers. This video will continue to play so you can see the same process used to split the other 2 feathers. Next, you are going to trim the feather fletching to fit on the arrow. For this part, you will need a sharp pair of scissors to trim the quill and the fletching. If the feather fletching has separated, then you can slowly breathe on that part of the feather or lightly lick your fingers and gently rub your thumb and your index finger along the split in the feather. You will slowly bring the fletching back together. This is the same process that birds use to maintain their feathers, and it is called preening. The feather fletching for the arrow will measure 4.5 to 5 inches in length. Take one of the split feathers and trim the top of the quill at the point where the height of the fletching begins to be consistently wide. Next, you will trim up from the top of the quill and cut away 1 inch of the fletching from next to the quill. Measure 4.5 to 5 inches down the length of the feather, beginning from the end point where you trimmed the fletching. At the end point that you measured along the quill, you will pinch the fletching right next to the quill and slowly begin to pull back along the feather. This will pull the fletching away from the quill. Once you have pulled away the fletching, you will cut the quill 1 inch away from the remaining fletching. You have now made the first of the 3 feather fletchings for the arrow. Using the first feather fletching as a template, repeat the same process for the next 2 feather halves. This video will show the other 2 feather halves being trimmed to match the first feather fletching. After the glue that is holding the arrowhead to the shaft has dried, you will want to apply a second application of glue to fill any gaps that have developed from the first application of the glue. Allow this second application of glue to dry for another 2 hours. At this point, before you begin gluing the feather fletching to the shaft, you may want to consider decorating the shaft. You can put burn marks along certain points of the shaft, or you can paint color banding using acrylic or oil paint. This is the old style of marking this as your arrow. Next, you're going to glue the feather fletching onto the arrow shaft. For this step, you will need 2 small clips or medium-sized binder clips and a small tube of super glue. Super glue is obviously not an old-style material used for arrow making, but it is recommended for this craft project for expediency. Place one of the fletching where the end is about 1.5 inches from and in line with the short notch end of the shaft. The point where the fletching meets the quill along the shaft is where you will run a small amount or bead of glue along the shaft. Make sure that you don't touch the super glue with your fingers. Take one of the 3 feather fletching and press that point where the end fletching meets the quill against the arrow shaft so that the glue can bind it in place. Take one of the clips and press it on the quill and arrow shaft so that it is holding that end of the feather fletching in place while the super glue dries. Make sure that the clip does not touch the super glue. Take the other end of the fletching and pull it tight along the arrow shaft to where it is pulled straight. Right here, where the fletching ends along the quills, where you will place the second bead of super glue to hold down this end of the feather fletching. Press the feather against the arrow shaft so that the glue can bind the feather fletching in place. Place a small clip to hold down this end of the feather fletching so the arrow shaft as the glue dries. Allow 3 minutes for the glue to dry. After the glue is dried, take off the clips. Lightly push against the feather fletching to make sure that the glue has thoroughly dried. If the feather fletching is firmly in place on the arrow shaft, then it is time to begin gluing down the second feather fletching. You will want to divide the shaft circumference by thirds and glue the remaining 2 feather fletching on the other 2/3 of the shaft. A good visual cue will be to glue the feather fletching to just the left and right of the short notch end of the shaft. Hold the second feather fletching along the shaft parallel to the first feather fletching that you previously glued down and estimate where you are applying the second applications of superglue. Apply a small bead or amount of superglue toward the end of the shaft on the area that is parallel to your first application of superglue. Place the second of the feather fletching and press that point where the end fletching meets the quill against the arrow shaft so that the glue can bind it in place. Take one of the clips and press it on the quill and arrow shaft so that it is holding that end of the arrow fletching in place while the superglue dries. Make sure that the clip does not touch the superglue. Take the other end of the fletching and pull it tight along the arrow shaft where it is pulled straight. Right here where the fletching ends along the quill is where you will place the second bead of superglue to hold down this end of the feather fletching. Press the feather against the arrow shaft so that the glue can bind the feather fletching in place. Place a small clip to hold down this end of the feather fletching to the arrow shaft as the glue dries. Allow 3 minutes for the glue to dry. Repeat the same process for the third feather fletching. After the glue is dried on the third feather fletching, remove the clips and make sure that the feather fletching is thoroughly glued in place. Next, you're going to trim the excess portions of the quill that are glued down to the arrow shaft. Use the utility knife and very carefully press against the quill about 1/2 inch from the feather fletching to cut away that section. Cut the excess quills of the other 2 feather fletchings to match the first one. Repeat the same process of trimming the excess quill for the opposite end of the feather fletching next to the short notch. Be sure to cut 1/2 inch from where the fletching meets the quill. For the next step, you are going to trim the height of the fletching. Place the arrow shaft to where the end of the arrow with the feather fletching is sticking out over the edge of a table. Lay something on top of the arrow shaft on the table so that it can act as a brace to keep the arrow shaft from rolling. Use a pair of scissors and slowly trim the fletching so that it is 1/2 of an inch tall. Try to keep the height of the fletching even all the way down the length. Rotate the arrow shaft to bring up the second feather fletching. If there's any separation, then use the same process you used earlier to preen the feather. Repeat the same process that you used to trim the first feather fletching for the second and third of the feather fletching. Now that the fletching is complete, you'll move to the next step of splitting and spinning the artificial sinew that will be used to wrap around the arrowhead and both ends of the feather fletching. Artificial sinew is a wax nylon cord that is meant to act just like real sinew. The first step to prep the artificial sinew is to split the sinew into 2 lengths. Carefully grab both sides of the artificial sinew and pull it apart. It should start separating into 2 pieces. You can use your index finger to act as a wedge to help separate the artificial sinew into 2 pieces. Next, you will be twisting the artificial sinew. When you have separated the artificial sinew into 2 pieces, take one end of the sinew and begin twisting it using your thumb and index finger. Once you have twisted a couple of times, then use your other hand and run it down a short length of the artificial sinew between 2 fingers. Once you've completed twisting this entire length of artificial sinew, repeat this process on the other piece of sinew that you previously split. Now you are moving on to the last steps to complete the arrow. Take the end 8 inches of one of the pieces of artificial sinew and form a loop 4 inches long between your thumb and index finger. Pinch the loop 1.5 inches from the end and set it against the notch holding the arrowhead. There should be a few inches of the shorter end of the sinew free along the shaft. The end of the loop should extend to just beyond the end of the arrow shaft. Pinch with your thumb and index finger on the loop next to the shaft to just below the inside part of the notch and then begin tightly wrapping using the longer free end of the sinew. Rotate the shaft as you wrap the sinew up the shaft to the base of the arrowhead. Take the longer free end of the artificial sinew and pull it through the loop. Now, take the shorter end of the sinew that helped form the loop and begin pulling it so the loop is closing and taking the other end of the sinew and forcing it underneath the wrap. When that end of the sinew is underneath the wrap, use the utility knife, pointed away from you, and cut the sinew on both ends of the wrap to where it is flush or level with the wrap. You are going to use the exact same process to wrap the quill of the feather fletching that is glued down to the shaft. Using the second piece of sinew, form a loop 4 inches long just like you did to wrap the arrowhead. The end of the loop should extend to just beyond the end of the trimmed part of the quill. Pinch with your thumb and index finger on the loop next to the shaft to just below the end of the quill and then begin tightly wrapping using the longer free end of the sinew. Rotate the shaft as you wrap the sinew up the shaft to the base of the fletching. Repeat this same process to wrap the other end of the feather fletching to the arrow shaft. Now that you've completed this last step of making the arrow, set the arrow on a table and take a good look. You've just made an arrow. This means you are awesome.